Not a lot.
I should check.
Let's see. There we go. So are we early? We don't need to record yet. Pause. You haven't had any. Everything's clear at your new place, right?
So
With
far,
water?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we checked the basement yesterday. We had some neighbors that were having trouble, but
Can we lower the laptop? I feel like I was.
Is that better?
Yeah. Thank you. Hello. Hey.
should have seen.
So is that pita? Is that pita bread or is that?
I presume so.
Yes, it's from Ben Scheller's defense.
Oh, that was today.
How did?
How did it go?
He didn't really.
Well, he made great hummus,
No,
but
he
also
was
the defense was great.
talking That's awesome.
Who was he working for?
Domenico. And I still don't know if I can tell you exactly what they were doing, but it was very fancy physics.
Geodesics.
Quantum.
Yeah, something about
Something
quantum,
about
computing.
Yeah.
Nice. So more than just basic hummus? Is it like seasoned?
It's got fancy seasoning and it's
Yeah.
like kind of chunky.
Yeah.
It's definitely not store bought.
Chunky hummus.
I like it.
You guys are making me hungry.
You might have some
I should have
left.
gone clearly.
Well, I mean, except
No.
that Jonathan has an hour with the doors closed between him and the hummus, so it's
Yeah,
pretty
he
much-
sat right in front of it and just eating it. Right next to it.
Sanda? Didgeridoo.
Or
yeah.
It works like a didgeridoo.
No, the thing that
That's
you
the thing
tip
that
it
can't
and you,
rain stick.
yeah. Anyway, it's multi-purpose.
I suppose it's in there to make it heavy.
It's definitely entertaining too. So.
Definitely. Okay.
How's your cost going?
Good, I think. Yeah.
Good.
We'll see. There's an exam on Thursday, so.
Do they have class on Friday also then?
No.
Oh,
no,
it's a
it's
Monday
just
through
Monday through
Thursday.
Thursday.
Good. We want to begin?
Yeah.
Yes?
All right.
Can't think of it.
Would you like to start?
Me?
Either you.
So, I got it. So who? No guilt. I just want to see where we are. Who is able to do the reading for this week? Okay, sweet. Maybe would one of you guys want to just, for the people who weren't able to read, summarize what you think some of the main themes were, and then we can dig into some other things. Anyone? O'Neill, what's something that
Okay, so as I was saying earlier, you got me. I was saying it earlier, so I guess I can't pretend that I wasn't saying it earlier. We're supposed to be avoiding perpetuation of illusions of knowing things, and it turns out that some of people's cool strategies. Oh goodness.
Oh,
Okay, so
There
cheers.
we go.
All right.
there's a vote.
Some of people's cool strategies for avoiding such illusions are themselves not helpful.
It's true, yeah. So this idea of the illusion of knowing comes up a lot in that students thinking that they know something, but they actually don't. They're not aware that they don't. And I think that we've probably all experienced that as teachers to some extent or another. One particular example that I put in here that that I always struggle with knowing how to respond to is when students have a test or a quiz and it's really poor and they come into you and they say, but I know this material, but I knew this material, right? But you see on the test or exam that, I mean, maybe they just made small errors, but sometimes you can clearly see, no, like, they do not know this material. I don't know if you guys had any thoughts on how you can help students. They talk a lot in this book about helping people realize when their strategies aren't effective, because if they don't realize they're not effective, they're not going to be motivated to change. But how you can do that as a teacher, besides just banging over the head and being like, no, what you're doing is wrong. Doesn't work. So yeah, I don't know if you guys had confronted that before, how you've helped students, or do you have any ideas?
So I think you were saying something about without students or without the teachers like telling them that they're wrong. I think like that's a big part of it. Students need to be able to find from themselves that they're making some of these mistakes rather than hearing from someone else.
Mm-hmm.
So that could include like having some kind of activity where they review some of the material and then review their own thought process as they're working through things, or often peer work also has a better effect than them getting something back that just says that they're doing something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Giving them abilities to self-monitor.
Yeah, and I think with that it was, some sort of self-quizzing or flashcards, and although I would say some sort of test or review test, and before they have any access to the answers, or any type of assistance, that they would need to understand, oh yeah, this is making sense, or oh, I really don't know this. So
Well, I think in math too, there's a lot of students I encounter, they will read through a problem or a solution and say, yes, I understand that.
mm-hmm.
But close the book and 2 minutes later, they can't even do that same problem.
Mm-hmm.
I think math especially is a subject where it's so easy to recognize structure, but
Yes.
it's so hard to build it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what students don't get, is that recognizing it and creating it yourself are very different things.
Yeah, and I think practically that can really tie into how students do use even practice tests, right? I think it's a very practical implementation of how we can help students, right? Because many students, I've seen them, they pull up the practice test and the solution, they'll read the problem, they'll sort of think about it, jot down a few things, and then they look at the solution, right? And they recognize the solution. It makes sense to them. It seems reasonable. It's like, oh yeah, I've got that problem. But that's very different than them being able to produce the whole thing themselves, and that confusion of recognizing the structure with having mastered the problem is pretty prevalent in my experience.
Yeah, like I can't remember who told me this, but somebody said at their alma mater, what they did was their professor had them take an exam in class, possibly maybe say like on a Thursday night like we do here, and then they would offer on Friday that you could take another exam if you felt like you didn't do well on your first exam, but if you took another exam, you would be graded on that one.
Got it.
So then they would have some input there, perhaps.
Yes.
I think someone did that here for differential equations.
Okay.
What a stressful structure.
Well, the thing is that like, I mean, it's like, it's at least a way for them to evaluate if they're ready.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not going to grade both.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder though if there's enough time between, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Like, what can you do in that 24 hours?
Well,
Review a little, I guess.
Yeah.
But
Very intentionally.
yeah, I
Yeah.
suppose.
I mean, it would be good for students who were able to accurately say, oh, in retrospect, I totally screwed up those two problems. And if I did it again, I would do it differently, which, I mean, some students will be wrong about thinking that that's what the situation is, but it could happen.
yeah,
It does happen.
You give them an opportunity to self-assess.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you did that early in the semester for the first exam, and then for the next exam you didn't do that, but you told them, remember when we did this, can you do the same thing for yourself? You know, like you don't need me to do that. After they experienced it.
Yeah, I like that because often first exams are the big point where students start to really understand the structure of the class. Right, like the first exam in any class is always difficult in some way because you're not used to the format of whatever that class is. So no, that I like that. That's interesting.
With this type of format, how far in advance do the students know that they'll get a second chance to? Does that
I would
affect the way they prepare?
Yeah, I would assume.
I think it was in the syllabus, for
Syllabus,
this
yeah.
class.
Okay.
You're worried about an easiness to abuse such a situation.
Yeah.
Sure.
They did talk about in the reading, based on something Joel said, this number 16, like the person who knows best what a student is struggling with is another student. So, like you said, incorporating group work and peer evaluations, would work as well, probably.
Yeah, I think these group projects would be more effective if they were graded. Then the individuals in the group would take them more seriously, because right now there's a lot of toss up on what each individual group actually does during that class time. I see a lot of people would rather just isolate themselves from everybody else and work on the quiz, for example.
Okay, so we talked about two different sort of calibration methods as far as maybe having a test before or different types of peer checks on knowledge. Do you have any other ideas or suggestions of how to provide essentially more of this corrective feedback, or how to help students learn how to provide it for themselves?
Well, it depends on what you're teaching them, but one thing that we've been doing lately in Calc 2 is lots of like, find the area in polar, or find the volume of this thing that you've gotten by rotation, and like, I don't, it's hard to know who actually ends up doing these things, but I've been trying to stress to students that like, if the problem is to find a physical quantity or something, then you can do some basic sanity checks that will get you a lot of the way there. Like if you find that the area of this little circle is 1 billion, that may be wrong. If you find that it's -2, that may be wrong. So like, it doesn't diagnose what the problem that happened, but it's at least, I don't know.
Check.
Yeah, I've kind of been feeling like some people are feeling like the important thing is arriving at any kind of answer and not necessarily caring what the answer is. Which, that's just kind of how it is sometimes.
Kind of along with that, I think that any type of like checking to see understanding does involve some kind of conceptual understanding as well. Like mathematics is something that you some people do tend to want to do like step by step. But if you're really trying to make sure that you are able to kind of build structure, one good thing that I'm trying to tie this into something I was thinking earlier. Like whenever you're studying for something, a lot of times it's good to look at multiple different problems and say, okay, what are common themes within these, and what's not just like how do I solve this, but what's the structure that I'm taking to be able to solve something like this. I think a lot of students don't think about studying in that way. They don't think about generalizing the process of what they're doing.
I think if they did that, it would help a lot with the quiz banks as well.
Yeah.
Like if you say, okay, you do them, what was the theme? Was the general process for all of these? And then when they have to repeat them, they didn't just memorize the details. They were looking at the whole picture. So we could get them to do that.
So we need a question 11 or a question 12 in the quiz bank questions.
What was the theme this week? The big, well, just state the section title, right? But yeah.
Do you find, Kate, I'm curious that your students, since I'm assuming many of them have dropped out of Calc 1 and are transitioning to your course, do you find that they are perhaps a little bit more aware of their knowledge because they've had an experience where they thought they knew something perhaps and then they didn't and they had to change, or not necessarily?
I mean, I haven't noticed that in particular, because I think like a lot of them possibly they dropped out because maybe they weren't feeling really good with their trig, and we're just kind of doing it what is a function, what is function notation, and so they're kind of I got this.
Got it.
Yeah, but one thing I do notice, because they do work in groups and they have to turn in assignments, and is that some groups like to really work together on every single problem, but most of the groups have just done this divide and conquer technique, which I actually used to do in my econ classes, which in some ways it is kind of helpful to get group work done, but I definitely noticed I never learned this much because it'd be okay, the person who's really good with talking about different, issues, they would deal with those problems. And I'd always get stuck with okay, the problems that have some sort of calculation in them, you do those.
Yes.
You can find the area of the triangle. And so yeah, I'm trying to think of kind of encourage them hey, you should all be doing them, maybe you want to do them individually and then come together and talk about them, or, kind of how to work more cohesively as a group.
Find a solution for that. Let us know, please.
Do you ever have them report out their answers?
Yeah, so they turn them in at the end of every day. So
I keep talking about sharing.
Yeah, but is there any class reporting, each team has to report an answer to this problem? I know sometimes, and again, it's a time factor for a lot of us, but I mean, in our team-based learning classes, we try to have something where they all have to report on the same problem, and theoretically, I'm supposed to be able to call on any member of that team to discuss how their team got that answer. Okay. I'm not saying we have this perfected because there are a lot of times that we don't get time to report.
Yeah.
But that's one way that at least initially stirs up enough incentive to be able to all talk about the same problem. But yeah, there's not always a lot of time either.
Another structure that kind of plays into them wanting to separate is everyone is doing some specialized things, and then they all come together and share what they did for their part. Now again, this is time consuming, and I don't think it works for all things. But yeah, that's an interesting structure that I've seen used before.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I've been conducting my exam reviews for Calc 3, as I have them. I have 4 problems. I have each of them specialize on one of the 4 problems and then share their answers. I noticed some of the students got really stressed, like they couldn't come up with a solution to their problem. So the students that were doing well in the class, they had no problem like explaining. I think it was good for them because, yeah, they had to get a deeper understanding in order to explain it to their group. Couple groups, they ended up having one person teaching them how to do all 4 of them though. And,
I wonder if you can reword it so it's like instead of necessarily asking them to solve the problem in their individual group, if they couldn't solve them, to interpret the problem or something. So then they don't feel like they're necessarily failing.
Or identify the steps in which, like, if I had this information, then I'd be able to continue.
And then at least you can kind of include the rest of the class to kind of fill in the gaps.
yeah, because we did use the last 10 or 15 minutes, like I took the students' notebooks and put them on the dot cam and we saw solutions. So, I mean, somebody got through at least each of the 4 problems.
I believe Nate and Fox, are you the only 2 who have Calc 1 or Calc 2 recitations?
Yeah, Calc 1.
Okay, Calc 1, got it. Do you guys feel like with your groups, I know with activities that aren't graded, there's not quite as much motivation to have something to hand in, but do you guys feel like you're seeing more of a divide and conquer approach or more of a work through problems together approach amongst people who are engaging?
Yeah, I think it sort of really depends on the group. Well, I guess it sort of really depends on the class. But like in my first class, it's really, I guess, cohesive, and they all make an effort to really do the, everyone is following along at every step of the way. But in my second class in particular, I've noticed it's much more of, well, people aren't always even focused on the activity itself. But those that are, it's generally one person stringing everyone else along. But then even that one person, because the problems are non-trivial. So even that one person has a lot of trouble. And that makes it harder as the TA as well, because then there's so many people. So sometimes I find it's just better to do pieces of it up on the board and sort of get the whole class up to speed. But yeah, I think it really depends on, I think, the personalities in the group.
I have a follow-up question. So, have you noticed any kind of correlation between people that do well in the quizzes and how they participate on the activities? Just not in terms of like they flew through the activity, but like they were actively working on it and putting in an effort.
I do in my last section, but that's my most motivated section.
Yeah.
I'm
just curious if you don't.
Yeah, but it's kind of a hard question to answer because like the students that you particularly focus on are the ones that really stand out. So those are the ones that are very vocal. But there's a lot of like silent students that are just they do really well. So I suppose you get a toss up.
Okay.
I also find it hard to distinguish who actually knows how to do the problem and who's just memorizing the solution.
Yeah.
Because I have so many people that just memorize the solution.
I suppose you can really tell the difference when you hand out the quiz and a number's change.
Yeah.
Everyone magically gets 2/3 when it's now 4/3.
Just magically.
Oh,
Yeah.
2/3.
Yeah, like this looks good, and then things go awry, and then 2/3.
Or when they do the wrong problem.
Oh.
That happens a lot.
Yeah. They did it with the numbers that were in that problem,
Mm-hmm.
but they just did the wrong problem.
Well, they adapting.
Like they solved the problem correctly. Like it was a genuine solution to a different problem.
To a different, yeah. Definitely seen some of that.
So we talked about illusions of knowing the student. But that was also interesting to switch that around a bit. Sometimes we as teachers can also get caught in the illusion of our students knowing something when they really don't. For a long time, I tried to keep this in mind, and I still do all the time. But if I've said something, and especially if I've said it really, really well, like I explained that so clearly, I really have this illusion in my mind that the students have understood it, right? Even though I have no confirmation of that whatsoever. The only evidence I have is that I've explained it well. So I was just wondering if you guys had any thoughts for how can you sort of protect against that side of things as well? What are some checks that you can do on student understanding?
I'm increasingly convinced that you should basically stop any time that you don't notice that there's a problem and just confirm with everyone that the last thing that you've been going over for 5 minutes actually was making sense to anyone.
How do you confirm?
Well, just try to stop talking and say, okay, does anyone have a question on this? Because when I was in Calc 2, I thought this was really hard. So you should have a question about this. It would be weird if it were obvious to everyone. And usually, if I sit there yammering about it for long enough, then someone will be brave enough to say, now that you mention it, I do.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't
sorry.
That doesn't specifically target like the students who are struggling the most or anything like that.
I've also heard, kind of at the, if you feel like you've explained something really well or you feel like you've been talking, at the end to just say, instead of like, does anyone have any questions, to be like, ask me a question.
I like that.
What questions do you have?
Yeah, because then it's not, then it's, I don't know, it's just a little bit of a nicer thing to hear.
So it's an expectation that questions.
Yeah, and I mean, if their questions, are like a bit more conceptual, then it can be like, oh, that was kind of a good check. Or if they're like, okay, I'm ready for an example. Please show me. Then they can go in.
I got caught a lot on that thing you mentioned, though, that if I'm talking and I ask the class a question and somebody answers, I think, oh, they all
That
got
must
it.
mean everybody got it, right?
It doesn't, but I've kind of just gone on anyway, one person answered, okay, somebody.
And that's why I think we have a lot of nice reporting systems in terms of, clickers for classes that use clickers, or just, quick problems that students can work on their own. Sometimes what I do that I found helpful is when I've gone through, we've talked about a particular topic or so on, I'll have students it sounds sort of corny, but I'll have them just give me a fist of 5. So I'll say, okay, if you are totally, this concept, you understood every word, you have mastered this. I want to see 5 fingers, right? If you have no idea what I just said, if nothing is making sense, 0. If you're sort of okay, 2, give me a read. And once you teach them how to do it, you can have them do it really quickly. And that can be a quick thing where you can just scan and see for everybody, more or less. And I try to phrase it too, not, I think phrasing is very important, as O'Neill was saying. So I try to phrase it too, not so much of how well, are you getting this, but more how well have I taught this, and tell them it's an indication of, okay, then I know if I have taught this effectively or not, or if I need to do something else. So again, that can sort of take away a bit of the pressure of I'm showing everyone that I don't understand this type thing. But
I do something like the fist of 5, but it's about 36 times better.
okay.
I have them do thumbs up or thumbs down,
I
so
like
you got
that.
180 degrees instead. But no, I was actually thinking with sorry.
No, I love it. Actually, I might do that now.
You should be doing radians.
Come on.
I was thinking throughout all this, definitely, the original question was, how do you, how do you know if your students are actually understanding something or not? And definitely asking questions consistently, but also even then it kind of goes back to, do the students understand what they understand or not?
Yes.
Yeah. So one thing that I do a lot is I'll have students pair up with each other. Like if there's a good moment in the some kind of concept that I know that students might need some extra time, or just whenever it makes sense, I'll have students kind of turn to each other and say, okay, explain what just happened. or can you answer this type of question, or see what kind of questions they have about something. That again is just another way of them able to process something, because it is easy for students to think that yes, they understand something, but as soon as they actually have to explain it to someone else, then that's where at least sometimes they get to recognize whether they actually understand it or not.
I think anytime you give them an opportunity to present some of their thinking and their work, it's a check on us, right?
Yeah.
Like, so if you're not familiar with the team-based learning process, so on Friday I gave students had a 5-question quiz on Canvas, and then they came to class on Friday and had the same 5-question quiz with their team. And then today, so that's supposed to help them get ready for a richer problem-solving session, which we had today, where they had to find the area of a polar graph. And so the second question said, okay, find the area of this small loop in this graph. And the very first question on the quiz that they had on Friday was, where does the formula for polar area come from? The integral of 1/2 r squared d theta. 91% answered correctly. It's from circular sectors. We get to the question today, find the area of this inner loop. Most people, they eventually got the bound set up. They knew they could use symmetry. The integral of r d theta. She's like, well, how did you get that formula? I don't know. That's right?
I
Just
had some students asking about that, and I thought their answer was interesting. They had never thought about what it meant to compare it to the Cartesian stuff back when we were talking about it at first, because it was like, oh, here's the new thing. It's the new thing.
Right.
But now they were like, a question that I got was, okay, so we've got the Cartesian plot of the radius, and we've got the polar plot of the function. This is on the Cartesian plot, the little loop. Should that be the same area as the polar one? And that actually led to kind of an interesting mini discussion. But they were thinking about it, but they hadn't thought about it previously.
But yeah, and going into class today, it's just like, all right, this is a fairly straightforward project. Yeah, this, it's fast for me. It'll go fast. And then it's just like, so very much like what they talk about in the sense of, this is easy for you now. You've been teaching it, and they're caught on it for the first time, where they actually have to apply it. Whereas the question on the quiz on Friday was more of just, see this real low-level knowledge-based question, and here I'm actually asking them to apply it in a completely different setting. And so.
But you did a nice job recognizing that early, because you were up there within 5 minutes. Because
Well, I taught my small class, and the same thing happened in small class.
Yes, great laid into the curse of knowledge.
Right.
Yeah, the idea for people who aren't able to read, the idea that when you are very familiar with content, or you've taught it many, many times, it can seem much, much simpler to you than it actually is to students. So I know when I first came, I've experienced that over and over and over again as a grad student, right? I go into various grad classes and, the professor's presenting it like it is obvious. Literally, like it is the most obvious thing ever. I'm like, no, that is the farthest thing from obvious in my mind right now. So that always, especially when I was taking more classes, that always was a huge reminder to me going into my own recitations, being like, oh, it's the same thing. And I want to make sure I'm bridging that gap and not just teaching at my own level of knowledge and assuming that it's clear. But yeah, do you guys have any thoughts about that, or any ideas for how you can stay more in tune to your students' level of knowledge when you're not at that level of knowledge?
So I kind of think I don't know. I guess try to have a good attitude when you're teaching easy material. Like, because the thing is, like, and Stephen Krantz, he's got a good teaching math book too. And he's like, you just got to know the material cold. But the challenge is not the material. The challenge is getting the students to understand the material. So as soon as you make that paradigm shift, that, okay, the material is easy, but that's not what I'm trying to do here. Then now you know what the challenge is, and now, so now you're just trying to understand what your students are thinking and understanding.
I was going to say pretty much the exact same thing. It's a difference between understanding the material and understanding how to break the material up into bite-sized pieces that can be digested.
One thing I try to like to do is like slow my thinking down, because like I don't really feel like I like have so much more like knowledge than them. I think I just have a better like intuition or like weeding out system when it comes, especially like with new problems of like, okay, I'm looking for this or I'm trying that, and it just kind of happens a lot quicker. And I think just kind of slowing down that thinking and just being like, like, okay, you know, if we looked at this problem, what are some things we should all be thinking about? Because those are things I think about still, like to this day, you know, and trying all these ideas, you know, like, and sometimes I can see a little further down, like that's not going to work out, but just like even slowing that down and being like, okay, let's see this not work out. I think that's something that kind of helps keep me like a little more grounded.
I think one thing that I need to do more consistently is, so for example, after today, jotting in a more permanent place some notes of, this is what happened. Students might not remember that this is what the formula is and where it came from. Be ready to discuss that. Or, you know, or is there another setup that you can help students anticipate what's coming and therefore bypass that little detour. But I think being reflective as a teacher helps that process. And I think also just interacting with others in the sense of, you know, working with recitation leaders and saying, okay, where are there flaws in this project? What can make this better? Where are students gonna go wrong? Because I've been at this longer and I don't always remember.
Yeah, I remember too. I feel like maybe this was one of the best breakdowns I was able to do is when I was here as a grad student first semester. I taught Calc 2, and we did all the like pumping, like moving the slab with the water, and then the center of that whole collection of types of problems there. And that was something that I had never really done much as an undergrad in my calculus program. And so I really had to dig into understanding and breaking it down for me because I didn't already have that knowledge, and I feel like I taught that material more effectively, and I had more empathy for students being confused with it, right? Because I was like, oh yeah, it took me a while to figure out too. It's not something that I just looked at on the page and was immediately apparent. And sorry, go ahead. I was going to say, I think that ties into to what Kate was saying, and that if you can let students have a window into your process a bit, I think that's both helpful for them and encouraging for them, right? It takes away the mystery of, oh, people who are smart at math just look at problems and they don't have to think through any different strategies in their mind. They just know it right away.
So kind of springboarding off of what you're saying. That's why, like, whenever we were first saying this, you know, cursive knowledge, I kind of immediately had I don't agree with that kind of reaction to it, mostly because it is a different type of knowledge. It is it is something that you do need to understand in a deeper and sometimes just completely different way from what's actually going on. So it's actually not that the knowledge itself, like having more knowledge makes it more difficult, but rather you need to understand the entire structure from where it's coming up from. And that's more knowledge than less knowledge.
Yes,
yeah.
I agree.
So I take offense to the phrase cursive knowledge.
Cursive knowledge, I can understand that. I can 100% understand that. So one thing I wanted to make sure that we touched upon, sort of me being selfish, is I just found it fascinating. But question 21 here. So the author references an exercise in which an instructor pairs students who had different answers to a question. And then they have to talk to the other student about their solution and figure out who is right and convince the other one, right? And they pointed that out as an example of a really rich activity and much more valuable than having students talk together who have the same answer, right? Because they don't have to clarify any thinking, they don't have to find those points of contention. But I was thinking about how in math, how we can encourage students to, that experience of having different answers to a problem is actually being a positive thing. Because that means you get to dig into it and figure out, why did you go this way, why did I go that way, and so on. But we tend to, in math, in many situations, really, really encourage getting the right answer, or those who don't are somehow experience some sort of consequence or don't get points or so on and so forth. So I was wondering if there are any ideas for how we could encourage students to see the benefit of having different answers and talking through solutions from the point of having different answers. Obviously, there are some instructional policies that support that too, and just our framework of how we do education, but I don't know if there were any small suggestions.
So you're reading through this, and it brought up memories of. I don't do this necessarily so much anymore, but maybe it's just because it's a shorter length format. But whenever I was teaching high school, a lot of times like we would be discussing different problems, and if I had two students who had different answers to something, I'd say, okay, we've got this student who has this solution to this. We've got this student who has this solution. Okay, and fight. and so I just essentially have them describe what's going on with there, and then. But just saying fight really gets people into it for some reason, and gets the rest of the class into it as well. Like, then other people will jump into different things. I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily helpful or not, but
no, I like it. I like it. But the idea that you do that is a positive, exciting thing.
Yeah,
that two people had different answers, and then it ends up with this good result.
I think I do see some of that behavior in the TRAD, IRAD thing, because I really do often see students say, well, here's how I did it, how did you do it?
Yes.
It doesn't happen a lot, but it's always encouraging to hear that.
Do you think?
And not just, I got C.
Right, and it's encouraging to hear that students got different answers, which means it's encouraging, if you frame that a certain way, that some students got the incorrect answer, which is an interesting phenomenon, because we're really incentivizing them all to get the correct answer, but we're more happy with what happens when they get different answers.
I think it's because whenever people have different answers, whenever people have the same answer, the conversation ends.
Right, exactly.
Right, whenever people have different answers, then it becomes a discussion of, okay, what actually happened here.
Exactly.
And ideally, it would happen in both situations, right? So I wonder if it is really something of, it's nice whenever students have different answers so something can be explored, or just we should just be exploring ideas more.
That's a great point.
I feel like as the semester has gone on in TBL anyway, I'm definitely hearing more and more of the positive discussion of like, okay, fine, so we did get the same answer, but we would be done with the TRAT in 2 minutes, and can we talk about some of this instead of their own volition kind of stuff, which, I don't know, it just kind of makes me want to do aspects of TBL, whether I'm doing TBL or not, such as permanent teams and frequent group discussions.
Do you guys switch up the teams in TBL, or are they the same teams all semester?
That's one of the foundational pieces of team-based learning, is that there's a certain number of hours that they have to spend together to really feel comfortable to really make gambles and really engage in the discussion. And so, yeah, it says to keep them the same all throughout the semester.
The teams really become very close too. They become good friends, and those friendships often continue after the class, which I like.
I feel like the past couple of weeks have been where teams have been crossing the, oh, we can actually just work on stuff and it's cool threshold.
Mm-hmm.
But that's like, so that's already like far more time this semester together than they would have in all of their recitations combined in a standard session of Calc 2.
So this is a different take on your question, but apparently Pearson has some technology that pairs up with the auditorium that you're in,
Okay.
so that you can log in your answer, and then you somehow see a pairing of where someone who has a different answer, and you have to meet up with them.
Wow.
That's a much more high tech than just a simple raise your hand if you got this answer. Okay, raise your hand if you got this answer. Look across the room, pair up with someone who had a different answer.
Just hold up boards with
Yeah,
the answer on
yeah,
it.
yeah.
So it actually is kind of a vocab, tells you where these people are in some way.
I got the impression that Chintzia used that last semester when we attended Raj's
yeah.
talk. That I think it's through Pearson's
What's that?
website.
It must be like is it something that students have on their laptops, or is it like a smartphone app, or?
I think it's probably a smartphone app, but she's able to gauge where the different answers are, and then I got the impression that it's all fairly automatic, but I haven't actually tried it. So. But yeah, implementing it, I think, yeah, I'm not sure that offers a lot of advantage opposed to just raising your hand or holding up a board or something.
I'm not thinking of having a fun activity where you have students plant incorrect answers and find some way to argue that.
Oh, I like that.
Just to, no?
Actually, I enjoy the learning style where it's kind of like you give them a type of problem that you know has an error in it, and they have to discover that error.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that could be helpful, like at the beginning, where it's kind of like you're testing their foundation.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if you have like a sum of two things in the numerator and a sum of two things in the denominator, and how you split this up.
Classic.
A lot of times, even in Calc 2, you see them making the mistake of splitting the denominators and stuff like that. It's kind of like, come on, guys. It's just you can't be making these mistakes at this level. It's or for example, I had a student in one of my office hours. These quizzes are pretty heavy in context, and if you're struggling with things like not knowing what sine of 0 is, it's like you're really far off course here, and yeah, that's the situation I was encountering. So, but my opinion on that was more so along the lines of how do we evaluate these students so we don't put them in calculus when they need to be taking something else. And I'm just like, I know a lot of students, because I talked to students quite a few students on a personal level to try and understand them more. And a lot of students feel like they don't have the background for this, or it's just like it's too trig heavy or something like that, especially trig. And it's kind of like, and I asked them, I'm like, well, didn't you take some sort of test coming in to evaluate where you should be? And quite a few of them said no, for some reason. I don't know. I don't know the situation.
No placement test? Nothing?
No.
You're supposed to have that
They all
Alex
have to
test.
take
They're all
Alex.
supposed to take
Well, that's
that.
what I thought, but
Maybe they forgot.
they forgot.
And they still do it.
They either forgot or they didn't it wasn't a big
They didn't realize
big
that was
thing
the
for them.
That's what it was for.
The AI, they didn't get far enough into the
Well,
trig.
Out of curiosity, how does that actually work? When do they take the ALEX test? As incoming
They're supposed to
students?
take it
summer?
before they come to summer orientation,
Okay. Do they take it here or at their own, wherever they are?
wherever they are.
I
Okay.
wish they took it here under a proctored situation, but they don't.
Even if they've taken calculus in high school, do they still have to take the ALEX exam?
Yes.
Okay.
And it comes with a free remediation package. If they take it, don't like what they did, there is a free, you've probably, some of you have taught in knowledge, where you have that little pie chart that shows what your knowledge is in each sector, and they have that, and the tutorial takes them through that. But I don't know what percentage of students actually do that. But if they don't get the score needed for calculus, they can remediate and then take the test again.
So something you said at the beginning, when you first started talking about like giving them something that's wrong and having them do something like that. Someone told me once about it, it was one of my old professors, a grad course they had, where the first day the professor said, at some point in this class, I'm going to lie to you. I'm going to tell you something that is not true. And not okay, you made a small error on the board kind of lie, I'm going to purposefully lie. And if you can figure out where the lie is, you will automatically get an A.
Oh my gosh.
And so they're okay, we got this. And they said they double checked everything. They were working in groups, trying to figure out where the lie was because they all wanted the A.
And it was the first.
No one could find it. And so at the end of the class, they were well, what was it? And he's well, it was me telling you that I would give you an A if you lied. He said the point is you all worked really hard to figure out, you double checked everything. You learned, you put a lot more effort in to check everything. You second guessed everything I said.
That would work for one semester.
Yeah, exactly.
So do you feel it helped you? Or
I didn't do it. This
Oh,
was
that-
someone told
yeah.
me about this. I always thought it was kind of interesting.
I would think that it could also teach you some good study habits. Hey,
Yeah.
look what I did going through this course, and it really worked.
Skepticism.
Of course, yes.
True lessons.
Yes.
I tell my students not to believe anything I tell them. They should check it themselves.
Maybe we got to provide incentive. Right?
Yeah, I was
So the
gonna say,
incentive
it's probably not
was
the
you get an
same
A.
Must have been tremendous pressure on the instructor, though, then not to make a mistake that semester.
Yeah, it's serious.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I had a professor, he'd type up the homework sets for us, and it seemed like there was a typo every other week, and just eventually I just got in the habit of trying to find a counterexample to the person I was listening to. I was okay, that's not true. But it was just so I could do the homework, though. I didn't get any extra credit or anything.
Was that last semester?
That was at Kent State, actually.
Just kidding. Actually, no. We really learned a lot when Peters wrote his own. He wrote his own notes and everything, and then of course he wrote his own problems.
We found his typos.
Yeah, we found
Yes.
we couldn't solve something. We found the typo. We brought it to his attention. He modified it. We solved it. And then there was one problem that ended up being a short paper that was published in the 80s. And he's and I went to him, I'm like, what's going on? And he's like, oh, I just want you guys to talk.
Yeah, I just wanted you to talk about
I was
it.
getting lonely, I guess.
I'm like, this is hard. I'm like, well, we did.
A really long time.
Yeah.
I think my favorite was on his exam, question 1, it said prove and disprove the following statement.
Oh. Makes me so uncomfortable.
We're just or? And he's like, yeah, or. We're like,
I was like, it's Schrodinger's cat.
Quite trickery as well.
Thanks.
Goodell's theorem.
answers you can do there.
Impossible. I think
It
we're
is
about
3.
at time here, but thanks everybody for coming, and if you have anything else you want to chat about, we're here, but I know most people have places to go.
Nice list of questions.
Yeah.
Collaboration, Mary and I, and then Travis's from last year, and we picked up some.
Good to have you.